May 1945, Fort Dix, New Jersey. The war in Europe has been over for only a week. But here, on the other side of the Atlantic, thousands of captured German soldiers still march under guard. Boots crunching against the gravel of Fort Dix, New Jersey. Their uniforms are torn, their faces hollow. The journey from the ruins of Europe to this quiet American camp feels unreal, almost dreamlike. Each morning, the prisoners line up for food. Oatmeal, bread, coffee. Most don't speak. They stare down at the steaming trays, grateful, confused. Some whisper to one another that American rations are better than what they'd eaten in months of war. Then, one afternoon, word spreads through the camp like a rumor too strange to believe. The kitchen workers. They're refugees, a sergeant murmurs. Jews. Silence ripples across the mess hall. Forks stop moving. For a long time, no one says a word. A few men glance at their plates, as if the food itself has turned to stone. Others keep eating, eyes fixed forward, pretending not to have heard. But deep down, they know what that means. The people serving them, the ones filling their bowls with soup, might have been the very ones they helped persecute. For the first time, some feel shame heavier than chains. Outside, the American guards keep their distance. They don't intervene. They let the silence settle, a silence more punishing than any command. In that moment, war, ideology, and pride collapse into something else entirely. The unbearable weight of being fed by those they'd once considered less than human. Across America, nearly 400,000 German POWs are scattered through more than 700 camps. From Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to the Dakotas. They work in farms, sawmills, and factories. They repair roads and harvest crops. For many, this captivity is their first taste of stability after years of chaos. And yet, it's filled with contradictions. The guards treat them by the book, firm, but not cruel. The Geneva Convention is respected. Red Cross trucks arrive weekly. Mail comes from home. But under that calm surface lies a quiet humiliation. They are now laborers for the people they once sought to conquer. In some camps, especially those near East Coast ports, the kitchen staff include refugees from Europe. Jews who escaped the Reich only to find themselves feeding its soldiers. In others, it's displaced Poles, Czechs, and French civilians. Survivors of villages burned, families executed, and homes taken by the very men standing in line for lunch. No speeches are made about it, no lessons taught. But each day, when trays slide across counters and eyes meet for just a second, something wordless passes between them. A captured lieutenant from the Wehrmacht would later write, "They fed us with hands that should have struck us. I never felt smaller in my life." Those camps became strange places where mercy became its own quiet punishment. As weeks turned into months, the men who once shouted, "Sieg Heil," now whispered thanks in broken English. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to awe. And for some, it was the beginning of understanding what they had truly fought for and lost. Autumn 1945. Across the English countryside, more than 150,000 German POWs wake to mist-covered fields and the distant toll of church bells. The war feels far away now, replaced by the damp air of a country rebuilding itself. In Lincolnshire, one camp sits beside a small farming village. Each morning, German prisoners are marched to nearby fields to gather potatoes and mend fences. They work alongside British civilians, men missing limbs, women with faded black armbands. There's no shouting here, just the rhythm of spades and the occasional exchange of words across language barriers. One day, a young prisoner named Otto notices a woman distributing sandwiches to the workers. She smiles faintly as she hands them out, her face tired but kind. It's only later that he learns her name. Ruth Stein, a Jewish refugee from Vienna. The only survivor of her family. For weeks, Otto avoids her gaze. He takes the food silently, nodding but saying nothing. Then one afternoon, as rain begins to fall, he finally asks through broken English, "Why do you feed us?" Ruth's answer is simple. "Because hate already took enough from me." That sentence spreads quietly among the prisoners. Some dismiss it as propaganda. Others lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of it over and over, because hate already took enough. In letters home, many write the same thought. The English do not hate us as we hated them. By late 1946, the camps begin to change. Prisoners form orchestras, plant vegetable gardens, even perform plays for locals. Slowly, the boundary between captor and captive softens. But for the Germans, the greatest shock remains that the people they'd been taught to despise, Jews, Poles, the enemy, were the ones showing them mercy. What began as captivity is turning into confrontation with conscience. And the silence that started in America now echoes across the quiet lanes of post-war Britain. If British camps were calm, the ones in France were anything but. Here, vengeance was close, raw, and justified. France had suffered too much to forgive easily. In 1945, nearly 1 million German POWs are forced to rebuild what they destroyed: bridges, railroads, entire towns. Conditions are harsh, rations thin, and resentment thick as the dust of shattered cities. French civilians watch them work from a distance, some spitting, others staring with hollow eyes. It's a hunger, not just for food, but for justice. Yet even here, moments of humanity break through. In a camp outside Chartres, a group of former French prisoners of Dachau volunteer in the kitchens. They serve watery soup and stale bread to German captives who can barely lift their heads. When an SS officer refuses to eat from a Frenchman's hand, a cook named André, a survivor himself, says quietly, "Then you refuse life." The officer eats. The paradox becomes unbearable for many Germans. Some fall into deep silence. Others weep openly when they learn who the kitchen workers truly are. One French commander later wrote, "I watched men taste shame for the first time. It was stronger than hunger." By 1946, the French government improves conditions under Allied pressure, but the emotional impact remains. German soldiers who survived those camps would speak decades later of those moments, when the people they had once starved or enslaved became the ones who kept them alive. Across three nations, America, Britain, France, the same truth is emerging. Survival has turned into moral reckoning. And for many Germans, captivity has become the beginning of conscience. By late 1945, a quiet experiment unfolds across the United States. The War Department calls it the Intellectual Diversion Program. The prisoners call it something else: the Camp of Minds. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, several hundred German officers, engineers, teachers, and former Nazi party members are chosen for a bold test. Instead of punishment, they are given access to books, lectures, and even newspapers. American officers believe that these men can be retrained, not as soldiers, but as citizens of a future Germany. The classrooms are simple: chalkboards nailed to wooden walls, folding chairs arranged in rows. But for the men who once marched beneath swastikas, they represent something far more dangerous than battle: ideas. The lectures begin with American history. Then come discussions on democracy, human rights, and the war crimes trials already underway in Nuremberg. Some prisoners mock it at first, calling it propaganda, but others listen, silently, uneasily. One day, a German major named Kurt Hoffmann, who had served on the Eastern Front, raises his hand during a discussion on freedom of the press. He asks, "If the truth is always printed, how do you hide your shame?" The American instructor pauses. "You don't," he replies. "You learn from it." That night, Hoffmann cannot sleep. He walks to the camp fence and looks up at the stars, realizing how much smaller the world feels when a man has to face himself. Weeks later, when Hoffman and others learn that the camp kitchen is staffed by refugees from Europe, some Jewish, some Polish, the silence returns heavier than ever. They eat quietly, each meal a sermon without words. By spring 1946, the experiment begins to work. The same men who once carried Hitler's orders start debating human dignity and governance. It's not conversion, it's awakening. And as letters home are censored and inspected, one line appears again and again in pencil-scrawled German. The Americans feed us and teach us better than we deserve. For every prisoner behind the wire, there's someone waiting beyond it. A wife in Hamburg, a mother in Dresden, a child in Cologne. The Red Cross delivers hundreds of thousands of censored letters each month, each one a fragile bridge between two ruined worlds. The words are cautious, controlled by regulations. Prisoners are forbidden from discussing politics, the war, or conditions of captivity. Yet between the lines, emotions bleed through. "We are treated fairly," one soldier writes. "The food is good. Do not worry for me." But others, more daring, hint at something deeper. "The men who serve us food, they are not what I expected. Perhaps the world is changing." Many of these letters pass through the hands of Jewish refugees working for the Allied Postal Service. The same people who had once been hunted by the Reich. They read the words of their former enemies, now humbled, afraid, unsure. Some weep quietly at their desks. Others simply stamp the letters "approved" and move on. In Germany, families gather around candlelight to read those fragile messages. For the first time, they sense that something has broken inside their men. Not physically, but morally. The tone has changed. The old arrogance is gone, replaced by a quiet gratitude they cannot yet understand. Meanwhile, in the camps, rumors spread that soon some will be sent home. But most stay months longer, caught between guilt and hope, wondering what home even means now. For many, these letters become confessions written in code, a way to ask for forgiveness without saying the words. And when they're told who's been sorting, censoring, and carrying those very letters, often Jews who lost everything, even the proudest of them cannot speak, because sometimes the cruelest punishment is mercy. Spring, 1946. The Red Cross vehicles roll into the camps with white emblems bright against mud-streaked jeeps. They arrive unannounced, clipboards in hand, polite but thorough. The prisoners line up for roll call. The guards straighten their belts. Every inspection is a reminder that the world is watching. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, one inspector pauses at the kitchen door. Inside, steam clouds the air as bread loaves are lifted from tin trays. The smell is rich, almost home-like. A refugee cook, Levi Grun, once a baker in Frankfurt, wipes his hands and nods to the soldiers, waiting for rations. Most of them know who he is by now. No one jokes, no one sneers. They take their portions silently, eyes lowered. The Red Cross notes that morale is remarkably high, but they miss the quiet storms beneath the surface. The long hours of reflection that come when men have nothing left to fight for but their own decency. At night, around the barrack stoves, conversations shift. Some talk about the Nuremberg trials broadcast on the camp radio. Others recall their villages reduced to dust. The arrogance of 1941 feels centuries away. One young soldier murmurs, They treat us better than we treated anyone. That is our sentence." The inspectors move on, unaware they are walking through invisible confessions. The war is over on paper, but in these camps it continues in the silence of thought. Each meal served by the refugees, each handshake with an American guard, chips away at what the Reich had built inside these men. A captain who once lectured about Aryan purity now spends evenings teaching English to a Jewish kitchen assistant. They never speak of the past. They don't need to. The act itself is its own atonement. The Red Cross leaves satisfied. The reports filed in Geneva speak of humane treatment and good discipline. They do not speak of guilt, awakening, or shame. Yet those are the truest measures of what's happening here. By late 1946, the barbed wire no longer feels like a cage. It feels like a mirror. Every sound inside the camp carries an echo from before. The clang of mess, tins recalls artillery. The barking of orders recalls the voices of men now dead. Captivity has become a country of ghosts. Many prisoners begin keeping journals. They write not about battles, but about the people feeding them. One entry found years later reads, "Her accent was Polish. She ladled soup as if she forgave me. I could not swallow." For some it's too much to bear. A handful refuse to eat, quietly punishing themselves. Others volunteer for extra work, desperate to feel useful again. But usefulness cannot erase memory. The Americans notice the change. A chaplain at Camp Concordia remarks, "They have begun to confess without confession." Sermons turn from victory to reconciliation. The word mercy is used more often now than enemy. When Christmas comes, something unexpected happens. The prisoners ask to hold a small service for all the dead. Not just Germans, everyone. They carve crosses and stars from scrap wood, placing them side by side in the snow. The guards allow it. Refugee cooks stand at the edge of the field, heads bowed. A cold wind sweeps across Kansas that night, carrying the sound of men singing softly in two languages, one that had tried to destroy the other. The melody is not triumphal, not proud. It's the fragile sound of understanding. For the first time since their capture, the Germans feel what true defeat means. Not loss of empire, but the discovery of humanity beyond ideology. They are being remade not by force, but by kindness. The kind that wounds and heals at once. By 1947, the war's dust has settled, but the world remains divided in politics, in memory, in shame. For the hundreds of thousands of German POWs still in American and British camps, the wait to return home feels endless. Rumors swirl of repatriation lists, of trains crossing the Rhine, of men being sent not to their homes, but to labor in France or the Soviet zone. At Camp Hearne, Texas, the loudspeakers crackle one morning with the announcement, "The first group will be sent back." The men stand at attention. Some cheer, others stare silently, knowing what awaits. A Germany in ruins. Families missing, cities bombed flat. Before they leave, the camp staff, including the refugee cooks, prepare one final meal. It's simple. Stew, bread and fruit, carefully arranged on metal trays. A Jewish worker named Hannah Weiss, who had fled Berlin in 1938, watches as the prisoners file through for the last time. Many stop to thank her. One older sergeant hesitates, then says quietly in German, "If I could change it all, I would." She nods. "Then remember that," she replies. "No bitterness, no absolution, just truth." As the trucks rumble away, dust rising behind them, an American guard writes in his journal, "They left with full stomachs and empty faces. They're going home, but they'll never really arrive." Across the Atlantic, the first POW trains pull into shattered German stations. Mothers cry, children stare at uniformed strangers they no longer recognize. Many former prisoners find no homes left, only rubble and silence. But inside they carry something unexpected, a seed of empathy planted by the people who fed them. They may not speak of it openly, but it will guide how they raise their children, how they talk about the war, how they choose to remember. The Germany they return to is unrecognizable. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden lie in ruins. Families scavenge among bricks for wood or metal to trade. American soldiers patrol streets now lined with black market stalls and hollow-eyed civilians. Many returning POWs feel disoriented. strangers in their own homeland. They bring stories that no one wants to hear, stories of kindness from captors, of meals cooked by those who should have hated them. Their families, still bitter and starved, cannot comprehend it. You're lucky you weren't sent to the Russians, some say. Don't talk about it. Forget. But not all do. In the town of Göttingen, a former Wehrmacht mechanic named Franz Adler opens a small bakery with the recipe he learned from a Jewish refugee cook in Louisiana. He bakes soft loaves and gives away half to hungry children. German, Polish, even displaced Jews. When someone asks why, he answers simply, because once they fed me. Across Germany, similar gestures appear quietly. Men repairing synagogues, teachers refusing to repeat propaganda, veterans volunteering in reconstruction efforts. They are not heroes. They are repentant survivors. The Allied authorities notice this shift. Re-education programs inside Germany, seeded by the lessons of the POW camps, begin to take root. Church sermons speak of humility, not vengeance. And in countless homes, mealtime becomes something sacred again. A reminder of when bread carried meaning beyond hunger. For those who had stood in the POW chow lines, every loaf, every shared meal is now a memory of that moment when they discovered who had fed them and could not speak. For the Jewish refugees who staffed Allied POW kitchens, mercy was never simple. Each tray they filled carried a memory, a face, a name, a loss that could not be erased by victory. In 1945, the US Army recruited displaced persons from across Europe to help with food services in POW facilities. Many were survivors or refugees whose families had perished in ghettos or camps. They wore American uniforms now, but inside they carried scars that no uniform could hide. One of them was David Rosenfeld, a Polish Jew who had escaped from Lvov in 1941. Assigned to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, he spent his days stirring kettles of soup for men wearing the same eagle insignia that had once hunted his family. At first, he worked in silence, not out of fear, but restraint. Then one morning, a young German corporal recognized his accent. "Are you one of them?" the prisoner asked softly. David didn't answer. He just ladled another scoop into the man's bowl. The corporal lowered his head. "Then thank you for feeding me." For Rosenfeld, that moment was unbearable. He walked behind the kitchen later, sat on an empty crate and wept. Not from pity, from exhaustion. The war had ended, but inside him, it was still raging. Others faced similar battles. In British camps, Jewish volunteers from Palestine, members of the Jewish Brigade, sometimes helped manage POWs awaiting transfer. Their discipline impressed both sides. When one German asked why Jews would show such restraint, a brigade officer replied, "Because we want to be human again." It wasn't forgiveness. It was reclamation. Feeding the enemy became a form of resistance, a way to prove that the Reich had failed to destroy the very humanity it despised. Every spoonful was a quiet declaration. You tried to erase us, and still, we feed you. For the German prisoners, that truth was almost unbearable. For the Jewish refugees, it was survival of the soul. Some refugees later admitted they hated what they were asked to do. They dreamed of turning their backs, of letting hunger speak justice. But each morning, duty returned with the smell of boiling soup and the hum of ration trucks. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, a refugee named Miriam Keller, who had survived internment in Vittel, France, worked as a kitchen assistant. Her co-workers knew her story. The German prisoners did not. She wore no star, no badge, only an American apron. One afternoon, a former SS soldier whispered a slur under his breath as he took his plate. Miriam froze. She could have refused him. Instead, she looked him in the eye and said quietly, "Eat. You'll remember this more than I will." The guard nearby, an American corporal, would later write in his diary, I saw forgiveness that wasn't forgiveness, just something stronger. The refugee workers often gathered after hours, sitting on the steps behind the kitchens. They didn't talk about revenge. They talked about rebuilding, about families lost, about what home meant now. Some prayed, some cursed. All carried the same unspoken question. Why am I feeding them? And yet, day after day, they returned. Because to stop would be to become what the Nazis had wanted them to become. Bitter, broken, inhuman. A US chaplain overseeing one camp wrote in a report, "Our greatest victory isn't military, it's moral. The ones who should hate most serve best." These kitchens, smoky and small, became sanctuaries of paradox, where mercy and grief boiled side by side. No one left unchanged, not the feeders, not the fed. By the 1950s, the POW camps were gone. Barbed wire pulled down, barracks dismantled, fields sown again with corn and wheat. But the silence between those who had once faced each other across mess tables did not disappear. It deepened, spreading quietly through post-war life. In Germany, returning prisoners rarely spoke of captivity. They mentioned fair treatment, good food, decent guards, but not who had served that food. That part stayed buried. Some feared disbelief, others shame. How could they explain that mercy had come from those they'd been taught to hate? But among the refugee workers, the memory was different. They carried it as a kind of scar they refused to hide. In letters, in interviews decades later, they described those moments with clarity and pain. The trembling hands of German soldiers receiving soup, the wordless gratitude, the tears that sometimes came after. One former cook, Anna Weiss, who later settled in New York, said, "When I handed them food, I wasn't forgiving them. I was reminding myself that I was still human." Meanwhile, historians collecting oral testimonies in the 1970s found the same recurring confession from former POWs, that the greatest lesson of captivity was being shown mercy by the unforgivable. In the rebuilt cities of West Germany, some of those men helped form local reconciliation groups. They organized exchange visits, scholarships, and youth meetings with Jewish communities abroad. A few even returned to America to find the camps where they'd been held, to say, "Thank you, decades too late." For them, that experience had not been humiliation, but transformation. In being fed by the victims of their regime, they had tasted the truth of defeat, not destruction, but conscience. The echo of that silence would last a lifetime, because what they couldn't say then became the moral foundation of the new Europe. The quiet understanding that civilization survives not by victory, but by restraint. Mercy leaves marks. For the refugees and survivors who served in those camps, peace was not relief. It was exhaustion. Many never returned to Europe. They built new lives in America, Canada, Israel, carrying with them a paradox too heavy to speak aloud. I fed my enemy so that I could live as myself again. In 1953, a community gathering in Brooklyn brought together several former refugee workers. Among them was David Rosenfeld, now a baker, and Miriam Keller, who had married and taught English to new immigrants. When asked if they ever regretted showing compassion, Keller shook her head. "No," she said. "I did it for me, not for them." Rosenfeld added, "We had to prove the Germans wrong. That hate doesn't last forever." But even in those new lives, memories intruded. The smell of soup, the clang of tin trays, a sudden glimpse of a uniform. All could bring it back. Some woke in the night to old dreams. Barbed wire, rain, and faces of men they once served in silence. Across the ocean, a few former prisoners tried to reach out. Letters arrived in neutral tones, beginning with, "To the kind woman who worked in the kitchen." Some were never answered. Others began friendships that lasted decades. Reconciliation did not erase the past, it gave it shape. By the 1960s, A handful of these stories surfaced in documentaries and memoirs, fragments of a truth almost too gentle for a brutal century. The world preferred grand battles and generals' names, not kitchens, not soup lines, but history often hides its deepest reckonings in the quietest places. For those who lived it, that brief exchange, food across a counter between enemy and victim, became proof that humanity could survive its own collapse. The story of mercy in captivity might have vanished with its witnesses, but mercy has a way of leaving trails. By the 1960s, both Germany and the Allies faced a new task: teaching the next generation what the war had really meant, not only in victories or crimes, but in the fragile, human moments in between. Former POWs who had experienced decency in Allied camps became quiet ambassadors for a different Germany. In schools, they spoke not of heroism, but of responsibility. They described how the Americans had treated them fairly, how the British had given them dignity, and how some of the people who fed them were Jews, the same people the Reich had tried to annihilate. In Hamburg, 1964, a gathering of ex-POWs organized a donation for Jewish war orphanages in Israel. Their chairman, a former Luftwaffe pilot, told the press, "We cannot return what we took, but we can honor what was given. Mercy." Across the ocean, in America, universities began inviting refugees and former camp workers to speak about moral recovery. They told students that compassion was not weakness, that feeding an enemy could be an act of victory. In Britain, church programs began sending young volunteers to rebuild bombed towns in Germany. Gestures inspired, in part, by the quiet humanity that had once crossed a prison counter. These movements did not make headlines, but they changed minds. A generation that had grown up in rubble began to learn that the real rebuilding started within. Every handshake across nations, every twinned town between England and Germany, every exchange of letters between veterans and survivors, all carried, hidden inside them, the memory of those camps. History textbooks would later call it the reconciliation era, but for the men and women who had lived it, it was something simpler, keeping the promise of that silence. The one that began the day German soldiers realized who was feeding them. By the 1970s, the last POWs were old men, their hair gone grey, their medals packed away in drawers. The refugee cooks and volunteers were older still, some frail, some blind, but still carrying a light no uniform could extinguish. Television crews began recording their memories, turning them into the documentaries that would shape how the world remembered the war. One scene stands out: a former German infantryman sitting before the camera, eyes wet. "She poured soup into my bowl," he says. "Her hand shook. I didn't know what to say. I still don't." The interviewer asks what he felt in that moment. "Ashamed," he replies, "and grateful, both at once. It broke something in me, something that needed to break." Historians later trace the moral rebuilding of post-war Germany, partly to experiences like his. Captivity that replaced hatred with humility. The Allies had intended only to detain these men. What they achieved instead was education in empathy. In Jewish communities, survivors spoke carefully about those same days. Some still felt anger, others pride. "Feeding them," one woman said, "was how we reminded the world we were still human. We would not become what they wanted." By the end of the century, these stories began to fade from living memory, but their lesson lingered in classrooms, memorials, and films. That mercy, shown even to the guilty, has the power to rebuild what war destroys most: the human soul. It is not an easy truth. It never was. But when the world looks back at its darkest hour, it is this light, a bowl of soup, a trembling hand that still glows against the ruins. By the 1980s and 1990s, the camps existed only in photographs and fading memories. The men and women who had lived through them began gathering at reunions academic panels, or memorial dedications. Fragile voices bridging what once felt impossible to cross. In Bonn, a small museum opened an exhibit titled Captivity and Conscience. It displayed original mess tins, hand-carved crosses, and a kitchen ladle dented from years of use. In a glass case lay a letter written by a German POW to his unknown cook. "I never learned your name, but you taught me what no uniform ever could." Visitors lingered longest at the photographs. German soldiers in orderly lines, refugees behind kitchen counters, both sides with eyes cast down. No one smiling, just the heavy, decent quiet of survival. For the Jewish volunteers and displaced persons who had fed the prisoners, old age brought both peace and pain. Many had built new families, but the war lived in their gestures. When interviewed, they spoke not of hatred, but of limits. The limit of revenge, the limit of forgiveness. "I didn't forgive them," said Ruth Stein, now in her 80s, "but I refused to poison myself any longer." For the former POWs, those meals became the hinge between two lives, the one they were taught to live and the one they chose afterward. A few wrote memoirs. Most simply told their grandchildren that they had once been prisoners in America or Britain, and that the people who fed them had changed their hearts. By then, the Cold War divided Europe again, yet within its tension lay a quiet moral bond, forged not by treaties, but by simple decency across a canteen counter. Even if the world forgot, the people who had lived it never did. The final witnesses began to fade as the century turned. Their stories, once whispered, became recordings archived in museums. Their faces flickering on screens in black and white, voices thin but steady. In 2002, an oral history session at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum captured the testimony of Levi Grun, the refugee baker from Frankfurt who had worked in an American camp kitchen. He was 92. When asked what he remembered most, he paused for nearly a minute before answering. "Their silence," he said. "When they found out who we were, you could hear it, like a curtain falling." He smiled faintly. "That silence was my revenge, because they had to see us as human. Finally." Later, the same year, a German documentary aired titled Fed by the Vanquished. It showed aging veterans visiting the remains of former camps in the US, standing before fields now filled with corn. Some left flowers, others tears. None spoke long. One of them, a former officer, placed his hand on the fence post and said, "This is where I began to be a man again." In that moment, history folded back on itself. The victims who had fed their enemies, the soldiers who had learned from shame, and a century that had nearly destroyed empathy, rediscovering it in the humblest act imaginable. By the early 2000s, few were left who could say, "I was there." But their legacy, the idea that mercy can outlive hatred, had become part of the moral DNA of Europe, and indeed of the modern world. Today, the fences are gone. The barracks have rotted into earth. Yet somewhere in the soil of two continents lies the memory of those impossible meals. The moments when a ladle of soup became more powerful than a rifle. Historians now call it the moral turn of captivity. It wasn't planned by generals or statesmen. It happened because ordinary people, cooks, guards, prisoners, acted with decency when the world least deserved it. Every act of mercy in those camps was a rebellion against the logic of war itself. In schools across Germany and America, these stories are finally taught alongside the battles. Students learn that the war's end was not only marked by surrender, but by transformation. That real victory came in the quiet dignity shown after the shooting stopped. In one German textbook, beneath a photograph of POWs eating in a US camp, the caption reads simply, "They were fed by those they had starved." That single line carries more weight than the statistics ever could. Jewish descendants of the refugee workers sometimes visit the sites where their parents once stood. They bring photographs, sometimes stones, sometimes nothing at all, only silence. One woman, the daughter of Ruth Stein, stands before an empty field in Lincolnshire and says softly, "This is where my mother learned that mercy is the last freedom." For veterans, the memory remains a haunting gift. They speak of it with reverence, not pride, because to be forgiven, even partially, is to be judged and redeemed in the same breath. The lesson has endured longer than any empire, that power fades, but humanity, when chosen against all reason, endures. Time has taken nearly all of them now. The guards, the cooks, the prisoners, gone, leaving only grainy photographs and the echo of their choices. But if you listen to those voices, faint on old recordings, you'll hear something remarkable. Not hatred, not excuses, just gratitude and silence. One tape, dated 1989, captures a frail German veteran speaking to a class of students. "We were hungry, and the people we thought were less than human fed us. I learned more in that line than in all my years of war." He pauses, and the room is still. "When I took that bowl of soup, I lost the war and found my soul." That is where this story truly ends. Not with surrender, but with recognition. That mercy, given freely, is the final victory of civilization over barbarism. That somewhere, behind barbed wire and shame, the better part of humanity survived, ladling soup into the hands of those who once denied its existence. The war taught the world how easily men can destroy, but what came after, in those quiet, smoky kitchens, taught us how hard and how necessary it is to rebuild. And though the camps are gone, the question they left behind still lingers in every generation. When faced with the defeated, the guilty, the enemy, will we feed them too? Because in the end, history remembers not who conquered, but who remained human.